Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those who are in the different parts of the world. Welcome to this Global Weather Enterprise Forum, online forum actually, dedicated to the legislative frameworks that enable public and private engagement. To those who don't know me, I'm Vladimir Tsirkunov, the head of Hydromet program of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery of the World Bank. Today's forum is organized jointly with the WMO Secretariat and involves participants from Global Weather Enterprise Forum Network, Open Consultative Platform Network, colleagues from the World Bank Hydromet Community of Practice, and others. Currently, I can see over 108 and 9 now participants, actually 10, so which is quite amazing to me because this topic, while very important, it's relatively narrow. Nevertheless, it confirmed that we were right in setting it up. And in this case, I recall that event where some of you participated a year ago. And that event was the Global Weather Enterprise Forum meeting among of the American Meteorological Society meeting in Boston. It was actually almost exactly a year ago. We presented our plans at this meeting, including organization of the number of activities, but as you may guess, COVID significantly changed our plans. This forum is one of those original events which we had to reshape to the virtual format. I hope that this forum will be nevertheless interesting and useful to all. I also want to let you know that another Global Weather Enterprise online forum event will be organized in March, and it will be dedicated to the socioeconomic benefits of the Hydromet value chain. Again, I hope that some of you will be interested to participate in that event as well. Today, we have an excellent panel and very interesting agenda, which you can see on your screens. I hope you can, yes, you can see it. And I hope there will be no problem with the sound. And before proceeding further, let me introduce our main communicator, if I may say, moderator, Mr. Dimitar Ivanov, the Director of Public and Private Engagement Office, the WMO. Joined the WMO Secretariat in 2009 as WMO representative for Europe. Then he served as the head of Aeronautical Meteorological Division. In January 2018, Mr. Ivanov was assigned the responsibility for public and private engagement, PPE, and he became the director of the newly established WMO PPE office in January 2020. Before joining the WMO, he worked for the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, and in his country, Bulgaria, Mr. Ivanov served as the head of the Aeronautical Meteorological Service of the Bulgarian Air Traffic Services Authority. Before that, he was a forecaster and researcher at the National Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology. With this, Dimitar, floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank you and your team for the organization of this Global Weather Enterprise Forum and for the kind invitation to me to moderate it. It's an honor and pleasure to do this job, and I look at it as a nice demonstration of the cooperation between the World Bank-GFDRR and the WMO initiatives on public-private engagement, the GWE Forum, and the Open Consultative Platform, respectively. And welcome to all participants. I see now that we have close to 120 participants. Hope that you had a good start of the new year, and we have all hopes that it will be much better year than the previous one. We have a very interesting topic to discuss today, legal frameworks and how they enable public-private engagement. It's a foundational element of all our activities, and we'll have a strong focus on PPE in these discussions. And we have a large panel today, and it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists. We have 6 panelists, I hope all of them are connected. So I'll start with my colleague Tatsuya Kimura, who sits together with me at the WMO Secretariat, where we follow strictly the COVID requirements, so you have to wear masks when we don't talk. Tatsuya is a seconded expert from Japan Meteorological Agency to WMO. He's been supporting the work of the WMO PP office since February 2020. In today's forum, Tatsuya will be wearing two hats, one as a WMO expert and another one as a JMA expert and long-time employee with various responsible positions. His recent focus in JMA was on promoting public-private engagement, including the improvement of the underpinning legal framework, which is very relevant to the theme of today's forum. The next panelist is Mr. Ian Lisk. Ian is a UK Met Office MP, but his role as a panelist today is linked more to his international role as the President of the WMO Commission for Weather, Water, Climate and Environmental Services, or shortly this is the CERCOM, one of the two new WMO technical commissions. The technical commissions are the main technical bodies working on the international regulatory frameworks and on standardization, which is one of the most important roles of WMO as a global standard-setting organization. Ian has more than 30 years of experience, national and international level, in various fields of meteorology, and he will share with us today his views on national and international regulatory frameworks. Next, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stella M.O, who is the Director of the Kenya Meteorological Department, the first female Director of KMD, and she is also the permanent representative of Kenya with the WMO. She has a long and distinguished career in meteorology environment, and her participation in today's panel is particularly welcomed with recent active work with her team on enhancing the national meteorological law in Kenya. So she'll be able to share with us her experience and maybe some lessons learned. We have two representatives of the private sector in the panel. I'll start with Dennis Schulze, the Managing Director of MeteoIQ. Before founding MeteoIQ, Dennis has worked for Meteo Group, which is Europe's largest private sector business, and is also chairing the PRIMAT, the organization of private companies, mostly from the service sector. Dennis has been active in the global weather enterprise discussions, advocating for open data access and better national regulations enabling private sector. The other representative of the private sector here in the panel is Jonathan Porter from AccuWeather. He is Vice President, Business Services and the General Manager, AccuWeather for Business. He's been leading AccuWeather's efforts to collaborate with many government meteorological services and other key data providers in order to ensure integration of most advanced weather data and technology into AccuWeather's products and services. By doing this, he has experienced various national legal environments, and his experience in this regard will be very useful for the discussion today. And last but not least, we have Steve Hodgson on the panel, who is a qualified environmental lawyer with experience of advising governments, international organizations, companies, and NGOs in around 50 countries around the world. He specializes in water law and fisheries and ocean governance. Steve has been helping development projects with his legal expertise, in particular when the national legal frameworks were in need for establishment or enhancement. In this panel on legislation, he will be the legal expert to help with his expert advice. So once again, I would like to thank to all panelists for their agreement to help us with this forum and for their time. The composition of the panel, if you allow me, one small joke is like 5 meteorologists and a lawyer enter a bar.
President, only one phone. Only one circle.
Hello? I hear some voices. So we can now start with a brief introduction of the subject. So why we focus on legal frameworks? On this slide, you can see that both the World Bank-GFDRR and WMO put a lot of emphasis on this subject. You can see here excerpts from the Power of Partnership report with its recommendation: support the development of transparent legal and regulatory framework. A stable institutional environment is crucial to implement the hydromet strategy for private sector development and sustainable PP. And specifically, a regulator should be designated and its role needs to be defined as needed. So this is one strong recommendation from this report. On the WMO side, in the WMO Geneva Declaration, which is the high-level policy on PPE, there is a specific call on all governments to give due consideration to the statements expressed in this declaration and to endeavor to put in place appropriate legislative and/or institutional arrangements to enable effective cross-sector partnerships and remove barriers to mutually beneficial cooperation and collaboration. And on the next slide, just to show as a baseline, a summary slide from a survey that we conducted in 2018 with participation of almost 100 countries, where this is the baseline. What is the situation with the legal framework? The question was, in your country, is there legislation and or regulation that determine the roles and relationship of public and private sector regarding the provision of meteorological, climatological, and hydrological information services? So this slide, in brief, only 1/3 of the countries responded positively that yes, there is such a legal framework that covers all aspects of this service delivery. About 40% of the responses were that there is partial legal framework elements, and most strikingly, 1/4 of the countries responded that there is nothing. It's almost it's a vacuum of legal or regulatory arrangements in their country. So this shows the need and the urgency of discussing and acting on this issue. And next slide, please. I would like also to use this slide from another report. It was from the USAID project on climate information services market assessment. And after analyzing a number of national legal frameworks, there is a very useful definition of types of legal environment vis-a-vis public-private engagement. So the report actually offers 3 types of such environment, which starts from prohibitive environment. A government department or agency provides all services, weather, climate information services. It's kind of a monopolistic situation in a country where there is very little latitude for the private sector or other stakeholders to operate, and this always requires very specific permissions. Then the other type of environment, constraint environment, there is, of course, another, again, some central role of the national government agency, but there is much more opportunity and possibility for the private sector and other stakeholders to participate in the various parts of the value chain. And finally, permissive environment, where the NMHS has an open data policy. This is a precondition for this, and government allows private companies to develop and own their own networks and provide services in many different areas. So the same report states that all these 3 types can be used in the various national legal environments, but of course the second and third type are much more oriented towards mutually beneficial arrangements, realizing the whole potential of the enterprise and providing better services to citizens and societies. So next slide. For opening our panel now, the panel is will be structured around these 4 questions. The first question is mostly to discuss what is a legal framework and what are the main elements, so to build kind of a common understanding of the issue. The second question is actually focused on the need, when we talk about regulatory framework, to have a central regulator or some recognized authority in this legal framework and very clear definition of roles and responsibilities in view of the current multi-stakeholder enterprise in all countries. The third question brings the international dimension. There is an international framework of regulations coming from WMO, of course, but also from ICAO, from IMO, from European legislation and others, which also need to be somehow adopted and promulgated through the national legal instruments. So here we'll talk about a more harmonized approach and how this international framework should penetrate into national legal systems. And finally, the fourth question is a specific focus on the situation in the developing countries, where the situation with the legal frameworks is in a stronger need for enhancement and improvement. So we'll be discussing how the international organizations like the World Bank or WMO could help in this improvement of the legal frameworks. With this introduction, I would like to now open the first question, the question on what should be the key elements of a national legal framework that meets the recommendations in the Geneva Declaration and the Power of Partnership report of the World Bank-GFDRR. So this is an important question to build our common understanding of the issue. And I would like to start with addressing this question first to my colleague Tatsuya Kimura. Tatsuya, we've been reviewing national legal instruments for the last year or so, and you're the main person involved in this. So could you please tell us what are your impressions of the main elements of the legal framework that exist and what could be recommended in this regard?
Yes, Dimitar. Thank you, everyone. From our said continuing review at the WMO PPE office on existing legislations of more than 80 WMO members, it seems that there are several key elements in national legal frameworks for meteorological service. Of course, there are variations depending on country situation. However, we have found national cases that will be good references to all members, all WMO members. The first key element is roles and mandates of NMF. Roles and mandates of an NMHS by legislation is one of the major premises so that the NMHS can, with confidence, deepen the engagement with private sector companies. The second key element is a data policy to share data and products with the private sector. Needless to say, this is because data is a fuel in the world of our meteorological service. The third key element is stipulations to enable public-private engagement. In order to materialize harmonized, effective, and comprehensive meteorological services in a country, it is necessary to clearly define the NMHS's regulator's role of all meteorological services in the country. And also to foster structured dialogue among sectors to get to know each other, to build more trust is important, and to promote uptake of WMO standards to the private sector for its increased contribution to World Meteorological Service is important. And the last one is to make possible outsourcing to the private sector to take advantage of private sector's capability. I will touch upon licensing in the Q&A section too. Thank you. Thank you, Dimitar.
Thank you, Tatsuya. Okay, so we see several elements which we've been discussing this in many global weather enterprise fora and WMO meetings. So the authoritative or official voice for public warnings, data policy, enabling PPE, and establishing dialogue. These are very important points. And I would like to now approach Stella with her work on a national law for the last year or so. How do you see these important elements, and do you have something to add to this from your experience at national legal framework development?
Thank you, Dimitar. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. For the regulatory framework, require a lot of government support and commitment. And like the previous speaker said, it involves a lot of consultation, bringing in all stakeholders so that the frameworks are owned. They don't look like they're emanating from only one sector or section of the stakeholders. And basically, they must be compliant with national and institutional regulations so that there's no clash with the other frameworks. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dimitar.
You're muted, Dimitar.
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Stella, thank you for these points. Consultations in the process of development of legal frameworks extremely important with many stakeholders that participate in the various parts of the value chain, and also with the authorities, relevant authorities, but also the need for what you do for meteorology to be aligned with the overall national legal system, because it's not a development on its own, it's part of a legal system. So good points for this outlining the elements. And how about a view from the private sector stakeholders? I'll probably go now to Dennis for your view on the elements of good national legislation enabling PPE.
Thank you, Dimitar. From a private sector view, of course, access to the basic meteorological data is very important, and that comes together, I think, with a sufficient funding of the National Meteorological Service to also provide this data, hopefully free of charge. So open access is preferred and can certainly come also in phases if that helps to implement better legislation and a better data policy. The second element is that the rules are applied in the same way for everybody. So if the National Meteorological Service also provides services to into the commercial environment, that there are the same rules and there's no cross-funding from public sources. That is also very important, and that comes together usually with and is supported by a clear definition of a public task within the legislative framework. And beyond the legal framework, that's the experience we have in primate, when we talk also to the public sector, that there is an open dialogue and good and trustful exchange of concerns and also the positive ideas and opportunities to better collaborate between the different stakeholders on the market, but also beyond towards the whole society. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Denis. I see your points on relation of what we talk, of course, to funding. So the question of legal framework and the regulatory framework is necessarily related to the public funding, and also the question of the so-called level playing field. So to have a equal treatment of the stakeholders, which I think in the third type of legal environment permissive is by default the case. So I think we are well now collecting these elements of the good national framework. I would like to go to Steve, our legal expert, just to ask Steve, from your perspective, are we missing something? And I understand that we talk sometime with the mainly thinking about a law called Meteorological Act or something like this, but when we talk about framework, it's something much broader. So there are other laws that are related to what NMHS do or what stakeholders do in the country. So what is your perspective on this, how we can actually make this discussion more inclusive?
Yes, thank you very much, Dimitar. Can you hear me okay? I think your point is very good. I mean, the meteorological law will be applied within an overall framework of law. And the key point there is about data policies and general data policies. So in a country with an open data policy, any meteorological law will generally have to be applied within that general policy. But I think this raises another point, is in the context is always crucially important. When we're looking at a MAT law, and particularly we're looking at how to engage the private sector, the first question is the basic data available? Is the NHMS actually collecting the data? And is that being funded by the government? And here we run into a problem, which is that in many countries, there isn't enough funding for these kind of services. So we start to think of innovative approaches, setting up MET agencies and giving them sort of quasi-commercial functions. And then sometimes we end up with an argument that they don't need to be funded from the government budget anymore because they're supposed to be self-supporting. And then they have an interest to actually perhaps close out the competition. So we end up with a problem that they just set up more and more restrictive practices. And this leads on to another point about regulation as well. We do need common standards, but we have to be a little bit careful that the NHMS, as a kind of quasi-regulator, doesn't abuse its powers and close down competition, especially if that competition is gnawing at its basic income. So there are a lot of factors to take into account, and I think we have to, general principles are good, but we always have to be fully aware of the particular context of the country concerned, as always.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think your point on the regulator function and how it should be used properly is a nice bridge to our second question. But just to summarize from the what we heard from the panelists, there is a good understanding of the main elements of the typical national regulatory framework that will be inclusive, enabling good partnerships and good engagement. And also, I think it was also indicative that in several interventions we mentioned the data, with the understanding that as we use now almost a cliche, data is the fuel of the enterprise. So whatever the regulatory framework is, the question of data policy and data availability access will be a central part of the discussion. So then with the mentioning that when we talk about the legal framework, we come to a question, okay, there is a regulatory framework. Who is the regulator? How is this body designated? what are the functions, and what are the good practices. Remembering what Steve said, that there is also a risk of some abuse of regulators' power. So the second question that we raise is based on the fact that National Met Services have been the central stakeholder in the national enterprise, and they, for many years and decades, they were combining the role of regulator and the provider of information services, which is now changing rapidly because of the much greater engagement of other stakeholders in the enterprise. So in the Geneva Declaration, there was a special attention to this fact, and there is a special mentioning the need to avoid anti-competitive behavior. So the question is, how could legislation overcome these problems to create an environment in which the entire enterprise thrives, in particular with the central regulator and the oversight body? Would it help establish and maintain a level playing field? So here I'd like to go first to Ian Lisk, the president of the CERTOM. And Ian, there are two reasons for going to you first. One is that before you became president of CERTOM, you were president of the Commission on Civil Aviation. And the services for aviation have always been the most regulated at national and international level services, very well regulated with very well established bodies as regulator, oversight provider. So with this with this experience from the aviation field, how do you see now the expansion of this need to have a regulator for other services in a multi-stakeholder environment? Over to you.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, Dimitar, and hello to everyone. Great to see so many people on this call. When I saw this question last week when we were preparing for today, I thought, God, that's a very, very hard question and almost impossible to answer. I was therefore delighted when Dimitar decided that I would have the first go at answering the question. Thank you, Dimitar. But in all seriousness, the other thing to say is, funny enough, that as the president of the Services Commission, I've always been rubbish at getting rid of my last job. So I'm still the chair of the Standing Committee on Aviation as well. So still got my fingers very much in the civil aviation pie as well. Look, no, it's really, really, really interesting question. I mean, I think in terms of what we're doing within the WMO at the moment, let's just start on that. We are looking to be much clearer about how we are defining and developing global technical regulations. But that's actually developing those regulations, and it really is still the remit at the national level for those regulations, how they're going to be used, how they're going to be implemented, and indeed how they are going to be regulated, for want of a better word. Definitely from a WMO perspective, though, with members. And when I say members, this is really important for everybody. Members includes National Met Services, the private sector, academia. Okay, so it's everybody in this together. We're all feeling the love and very much in this together. We are looking to, within the WMO, to engender a culture of compliance, really, really important at the sort of global level, in the development of those tech regs, and of course more guidance on how to implement the technical regs at the national level, both in terms of guidance for the service providers, but also through forums like this, guidance on those who are overseeing the implementation at the national level. And that's for all sectors, and I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the aviation sector in particular in a moment. It's a key role of the two new commissions, the Services Commission and the Infrastructure Commission. I'm pleased to say today, I'm going to take this opportunity to say that we have now got those two commissions up and running and delivering some work. It has been a nightmare trying to basically reinvent the WMO with all the COVID restrictions on travel and meetings over the last year. But we are now up and running and ready for action. I think it's also important in terms of the regulatory sort of role is to be very clear about what's in and what's out in terms of different sectors. I think we all recognise that the delivery of government-sponsored, mandated public safety warning and informing services very much should be within the core remit of all national meteorological and hydrological services worldwide. Outside of that remit, though, when we get into other sectors, and let's talk about aviation for a moment, because it is heavily regulated, the international aviation side of things. And of course, that regulator is the International Civil Aviation Organization based out of Montreal in Canada. And what the ICAO does, it coordinates the gathering of requirements. So it's very, very user focused. You know, they don't do anything or don't promote anything that is not in line with user needs. And then basically that is then for all states to sign up for those regulations, those standards and recommended practice, and to actually discharge those through service providers. Now, got to be absolutely clear here. In terms of international civil aviation, there is no divine right for any of aviation services to be provided by a national Met service. It's market conditions. They can be provided, and in fact are, by many services provided by private sector providers. But it is a level playing field. And this word's going to come up again and again, because those standards are the same for everybody, the service providers, and compliance with those standards is really important. Now, in terms of the regulation and the oversight and the enforcement of those standards at the national level, well, basically at the national level, there is a regulator who will oversee the service provider in terms of the implementation of those standards, and will hold the service providers' feet to the fire in terms of making sure they're discharging those responsibilities in line with quality management principles and compliance with the standards as well. Now, for many years, the service provider and the regulator, in a lot of cases, were one and the same organisation. Within the International Civil Aviation Organization sort of framework, though, best practice has increasingly driven the fact that that regulatory function should be done by an independent body. So the service provider, you know, whether it's a national Met service or not, should not be regulating and overseeing themselves. And definitely in Europe, with single European sky legislation, that is actually mandated. The fact that, you know, single European sky aviation in Europe, the regulatory function and the service provider function have to be fully independent. So that's why it's a very, very hard question, because if we're talking about all of meteorology and the role of regulators, well, number one thing I say, it's important that they are independent. The second thing I would say in terms of global regulation, is there a role for the WMO over the top of that, and the way that the ICAO does it through the ICAO safety audits? I would have to say I don't think there is. I think the WMO role is in setting those technical regulations, providing as much guidance as possible. And it is then down to the national side of things to, you know, in line with best practice, to oversee those with as much independence as possible. And again, with the technical regulations that we are putting far more work into doing, the normative work that we do within the WMO, what we'll also be doing is creating that level playing field. These are minimum standards for everyone, whether you're from the private sector, the public sector, and what have you. And like I say, we're all sharing that best practice and giving the users, most importantly, what they want at the right price, with all the good practices, which are mostly underpinned by sort of quality management systems. So I've talked a lot there. I'll leave you to digest that, and I'll over to you, Dimitar, for whoever you want to go to next. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you. This was a very good response to this question of the role of the regulator, and the aviation example is interesting to be followed. Of course, the need for international regulation in the different parts of the services varies quite a lot. So aviation is a special case where a pilot flying from point A to point B crosses so many borders. So you need to have a well-harmonized regulations across the route and across to enable the international business. And role of WMO, as you mentioned, strengthening the international regulatory framework is a very important message, because the better the regulations from the international regulator, the easier they penetrate to the national regulatory framework. Now, I would like to go to our colleagues from the private sector again, and this time to John. I know that you've been working with many national agencies. Recently we appreciated the way AccuWeather is treating the provision of warnings using the official source through your applications, and attributing the official source to this most important pieces of information. So when you go to a country to talk to the local authorities and providers, is it easy to identify who is the regulator, who is the roles of the stakeholders in a country, how this varies from country to country?
Well, Dimitar, that's a very good question. And first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation. And it's a special occasion to be able to see all of our many friends from around the world here who we've not been able to see over the last year or so. So it's good to see our friends in that regard as well. And I want to comment a couple of things here. This is a great conversation. These are more of the conversations that we need to have in terms of how to work together collaboratively across the world weather enterprise. Dimitar, exactly to your question, I appreciate your comment about AccuWeather's work in terms of delivering the weather warnings, the official weather warnings, directly in our weather app and our mobile and desktop websites, which are viewed by more than 1.5 billion people each and every day in over 200 languages and dialects all over the world. And we work with over 65 countries to integrate their official public weather warnings, to distribute those warnings to people in harm's way. You mentioned about the different, we've talked, Dennis and others have talked about, and Ian, the differences in each country. And I think that's really an important point, that it's hard, there's not going to be, I don't think, an international way to regulate the cooperation between the private sector and government entities, because so much is different on a nation by nation level. And I think that's actually a good thing. And the international regulator WMO in that capacity has a very important role to play as it relates to setting and describing the best practices that can be used for effective partnership across the world. Specifically to your point, when we go to individual countries, there's a lot of variety. Sometimes it's not very clear who the regulator is. It's not very clear what the data policy is. We have found that through the collaboration, though, that in many cases, government national meteorologic services want to provide their foundational data and make it available to a wider audience. There are, as you mentioned, and we do have to address as a community, some of the anti-competitive practices that do exist. But I would tell you that having been involved in this sector now for more than a decade, there's a big evolution that governments and NMHSs are recognizing that the more data, the more of their foundational data that gets out and is made available to the public, it actually raises their awareness of the great work that they do as an NMHS to a much broader audience. And in many cases, we've actually been able to help the governments to advocate for more funding of their basic data collection and processing, because now a much wider audience is getting the benefit of their data. It's interesting, since we have so many users all around the world, as I mentioned, when we add the warnings of from new countries that we're bringing online through our system, and we make it very easy for the governments to plug their warnings into our framework. It's a very flexible framework, and we work with them very collaboratively. But we get feedback from our users that say, wow, that warning from my government, I didn't even know my government provided that information. So it really has been very interesting and inspiring to see how our provision of those official government warnings to a much wider audience has been beneficial to that NMHS. I would say one other aspect of that too is that we feel very strongly about the authoritative voice for the government in terms of weather warnings to the public. And although we have and provide a wide range of specialized commercial services to companies all around the world, on the public service side, we in the weather enterprise are united in our common public service mission. We're all passionate about what we do because we want to get the very best forecasts and warnings to people in harm's way, and increasingly in harm's way all around the world from weather and other types of natural disasters. And I think by recognizing that common shared mission that we have and that motivation that drives us to really continue to innovate together to achieve that mission, to save lives and protect property, we can find a lot of common ground there. And we've been very flexible with governments in recognizing that is not a one-size-fits-all approach in each country, and each country needs to be considered for the complexities or the opportunities that exist within that country. But we've found that there's an increasing awareness and desire to get information out, to make it available to a wider audience. And I would also comment that a lot of times governments sometimes aren't sure where to start. And I would say that that's okay. And it's okay to start making some data available and then see how that goes and see what the benefits of that are, and think about what kind of framework can be applied within the country's laws in order to be able to accelerate that great benefit. We always have a saying that information wants to be out there and it wants to be made available. And I think governments have really found that by making that information available to a much wider audience, it inspires innovation and it unlocks the true potential of that data as opposed to being just captured in one particular spot. So thanks again for the opportunity. Look forward to our conversation today, and over to you, Dimitar.
Thank you very much, John. Very encouraging hearing from you the respect to the need for authoritative voice and your observation on changing behavior, changing culture in the countries you're working with. This is extremely encouraging, and I also fully agree with the notion of unified public service mission, the joint contribution to the public good and to safety of people and property. So that's part of very important part of this discussion to see this changing environment and how this will contribute to a better regulatory frameworks, legal frameworks. I would like to just look at my timer. We are a little bit behind. So one additional comment on this question. I would like to go back to Tatsuya. This time as with his experience with the JMA, Japan Meteorological Agency, one of the countries with a very well-established legal framework and with system for licensing operators. So a few words, Tatsuya, about your
quick, right?
Yeah, about licensing. It's part of the regulatory function of the regulator.
Okay. The whole meteorological service in Japan is regulated by JMA in accordance with the Meteorological Service Act, promulgated in 1952, which purpose is to ensure the sound development of whole meteorological service in Japan. The Act provides for minimum required regulations on meteorological services in Japan conducted by various bodies, including JMA. For more than 70 years, JMA has granted other entities a license to forecast. What had been licensed from 1950 to 1994 were limited to forecasting for specific clients only, as well as public commentary service on JMA's forecasts. In 1994, when JMA enhanced its licensing system for newly allowing other bodies to publicly issue forecasts, JMA introduced a certified weather forecasters system to ensure private sector's service quality. Namely, commercial entities licensed to provide weather forecasts must employ certified weather forecasters with requisite levels of expertise to perform the core part of forecasting, namely prediction of phenomena. This major deregulation was started to allow point-by-point forecasting and followed by step-by-step deregulations. Also, on that occasion, in 1994, JMA enhanced its measures to support the private sector, including online real-time data provision at marginal cost through our newly established foundation. This foundation has handled all procedural matters with each private sector company and has held information sessions on new or improved data and products produced by JMA for private sector's better handling of them, and also provided training opportunities and et cetera. The said licensing system, along with non-discriminatory, very high affordability of meteorological data and products, has created a lot of opportunities for more and more companies to start and conduct quality services in Japan. That's all, Dimitar. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatsuya. This is as I said, a very good example of one type of national legal framework in which things are very clearly defined, and through a licensing system, there is also measures to ensure quality, continuity, and consistency. Of course, in some other views, this could be seen also as some sort of limiting the potential for better engagement, but depends on how all this is conducted as a practice. And I like the word deregulation. So one legal system may start with a very sort of prohibitive type of system, and gradually through deregulation to provide more freedom for operations with the maturity of the market and the stakeholders engaged. So now we are going to move to the next question. And at the same time, I see a very active, great activity on the chat, very good comments and views expressed. I don't know how much time we'll have to address some of these, but once we finish our panel discussion, we'll try to select several questions and to try to question his views and the comments to discuss a little bit with the panelists. So this third question is linked to the previous one because we talk again about the international regulatory framework and how this should be integrated in the international legislation. So on this question, I would like to first start with Steve, again, from legal perspective. The international regulatory frameworks, what is their importance? How binding are they for the member states of the respective organizations, and how these international provisions should be reflected in the national regulations and legal instruments? Steve?
Thank you very much, Dimitar. Yeah, this is a complex topic, and I'll try and be as concise as possible. So we start off with WMO itself as the global standard-setting organization. The WMO convention basically sets up WMO and allows the technical regulations to be adopted by the Congress subsequently. The WMO convention is not a global weather convention. It's not like the Convention on Biological Diversity or the Climate Change Convention. It doesn't try and address a big problem. It sets up an organization, namely WMO. Now, in the question, in the background to the question, there's mention of a couple of other organizations such as the IMO and the EU. So the International Maritime Organization has actually sponsored a number of very important conventions. There's about 10 or 15 of them, such as the COLREGS, SOLAS, and so on and so forth, in which the member states of IMO have agreed detailed technical rules about various aspects of shipping and navigation. Now, a problem for IMO, as all international conventions, all international agreements, is enforcement. We don't have a world court. We don't have a world policeman. This is a problem of international law. International law lacks many of the features of national law. No real global parliament either. So enforcement is always a problem, even for IMO, even with its very detailed conventions, which are legally binding and regularly updated through the IMO system. The EU is a little bit different because the EU has its own enforcement mechanism. It has the European Court of Justice, which can fine the member states for non-compliance with EU law. So that's a little bit different altogether. It's a regional organization in any event, obviously. So coming back to IMO, when you look at the technical regulations, you have to read the words very, very carefully. And in international law, we always distinguish between shall and should. So shall means must, you've got to do it. And should means you really should do your best, but if you don't do it, you're not contravening the particular rule. However, when you look at the technical regulations, even the shall is somewhat watered down. It's shall as kind of far as possible. And many of the technical regulations are actually about shoulds. So should provide a public weather service, should provide a warning system. It's not a shall. So already we're not as tough, we're not as hard in terms of our technical rules as we perhaps could be under international law. Now, does that matter? That's really the heart of the question. And I would say probably not, because the fact is that all of the country members of WMO are different. They have different challenges. They have different problems. They have different economic situation, different social situation. So if we tried to make very, very strict rules about the weather enterprise in general, about public-private engagement in particular, we would still have this problem of enforcement that we have under all of the international legal system and under all conventions. So probably more regulation is not better in this sense. What we need is more discussion, more outreach, more capacity building, more understanding for a common objective and a common end. So I'll stop there. Back to you, Dimitar.
Thank you very much, Steve. This is a very clear explanation, and I think we've been facing this problem of the difficulty of enforcement, but the understanding that actually WMO, ICAO, and others, international organizations, they work through consensus, and their regulations express commitment, and we expect the member states to do their utmost to implement, but of course there will be variations always, and there will be also, in some cases, due to limited capacity, difficulties to implement some of these regulations. In any case, some main elements of the international policy and regulation should penetrate to the national legal framework. And what we do now, in particular on the data policy, very active work in WMO on our famous Resolution 40 and its update. We expect that member states, as Jens said, these are states with all the stakeholders in the enterprise, we expect them to follow this international policy to ensure broader sharing of the Earth system data. So Ian, again, back to you, just maybe a little bit of addition to what you already mentioned with what your CERCOM plans are on improving this international regulatory framework. As Steve said, not more, but better, probably, regulations.
So I completely agree with what Steve has just said, and I think it goes back to what I said in my answer to the first question in terms of the role of the WMO in actually setting those technical regulations. And again, Steve, I completely appreciate what you're saying about the should and the shalls. I mean, even in the ICAO world, which is really heavily regulated, has lots of shalls, lots and lots of shalls, with the safety oversight body that goes into countries and talks to regulators about how those are being enforced. I don't think there are incredibly few examples of where service providers have been in breach of the shalls where designation has been removed. So even within the aviation industry, designation being removed for not following the rules is incredibly rare. And that's for something that's so dependent on safety like the aviation industry. The other thing I'm going to say about the question that you set us here, Dimitar, I'm really glad that it says transposed and not imposed. Again, goes back to what Steve was saying about the fact that, I mean, really, in terms of enforcement, I'll keep using the fact that, you know, from a service provider point of view, the most important thing you can do, whether you're providing services for aviation or for the public or for agriculture, is if you follow quality management framework rules, you know, you follow that whole principles of quality management, you are not going to go far wrong in terms of the services that you are actually providing. And that's one of the reasons why quality management is written within the doctrine of everything that aviation does. It talks about talking to your users, keep checking what you're doing. You know, quality obviously sits within that, follow the standards, etc. So really, really important, QMS, in all aspects, whatever the sector is. In terms of the public side, and just going back to that for one moment, I mean, of course, it should be driven by national government legislation. But again, you look around the world, Tatsuya's just talked about the JMA and how it works. The JMA is the regulator and the service provider, but it is regulated. In the UK, you know, the good old Met Office, you know, there are no laws that say that the Met Office must provide public warnings, right? Absolutely, end of story. The only mandate that the Met Office legally has is to actually maintain the National Archive. The only link to what the Met Office does in terms of warning and informing is written into the Civil Contingencies Act from 2004, which says that the government should actually use information from the Met Office, but it's a should, not a shall, and you have to have been around a very long time to be able to find those references as well. When you get away from the public side of things, particularly with aviation, and I'll use that example again, we are into the market condition side of things. It's about the best for less, being useful, usable and used, customer focused, you know, the sustainability side of things, you know, how long you're going to be around. And certainly when we're talking about the global thing, another benefit of having regulations looked after internationally by the WMO in terms of developing those regulations is it does engender a consistency of approach around the world. So wherever you go, in the 192, 193 members of the WMO, if everyone's following or trying to follow or comply with the technical regulations set by the WMO, then at least we've got a consistency approach around the world. And, you know, that certainly gets my vote. Thank you. Over to you, those magic words.
Thank you, Ian. So one very quick comment now from private sector guys. So Dennis, can you just say a bit about international regulations and their meaning for private sector stakeholders?
So I think for a private sector, it's very important to have predictability. It's not just in a weather sense, but also in a legal framework sense. So it's good to have WMO to agree rules and hope that national governments respect them and implement them. I would like to mention two more aspects on that subject. How we can influence that in a better direction. One is, I think we need to look beyond meteorology. Often meteorology is too small a sector to achieve a large open data change in governments. I think the EU discussion about high-value data sets is a good example where also mapping data was looked at and other economic information as public sector information. And it was researched how much additional economic benefit there is when making this data available. So that's going beyond meteorology is, I think, important. And the other aspect is also in terms of funding. When we look into research funding, it's expected that the results of that funding are also made available by publications and can be accessed by everybody. I think that should also be the standard when data networks are funded, like by the World Bank, that the resulting data is also made available for the broader community. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Now, we are switching to question number 4, and this is just main focus on developing countries and the need for better legal frameworks for developing countries. I think that logically, of course, I'll approach Stella with this question first. First of all, as I said, Kenya Met Department is now working on their new law, but one question that came from Alan through the chat, could you comment on what could stimulate a government to develop a regulatory framework when it doesn't exist? Is it a matter of lobbying governments? Should NMHSs have a role to help in this? So I think, Stella, you're in the best position to tell us how the process in setting up national regulatory framework work for your case in Kenya.
Thank you, Dimitar. In Kenya, for quite a while, for very many years, more than 20 years, the Met Service has tried to become a semi-autonomous government agency, and we worked on the documents, and we didn't seem to be moving anywhere. But what I noted is when we quoted that the recommendations from the regional, from WMO, saying that according to WMO best practices, the Met services are better off the links from the mainstream civil service, and we've given examples. And you find that resolutions from the regional institutions, such as the African Union, the East African Community, were encouraging the Met services to become semi-autonomous so that they can provide the information in a manner where they are not constrained. Then the government started to buy into that, the idea. And like now, when you talk about East Africa, for example, all the we have 6 countries, and it's only 2 of us who are not semi-autonomous. And this is what, when you quote this kind of thing about WMO best practices and whatever, then you find that you get support from the government to come up with a legal framework to become semi-autonomous. Over to you.
Thank you, Stella. And if I can follow a little bit on this with you, in your the draft Meteorological Act, to what extent the public-private engagement is included in this new law that you're working on? Are there any special provisions for encouraging more public-private engagement in Kenya?
Thank you, Dimitar. Yeah, it comes out very clearly that in order for us to provide services, we need to partner with other institutions. And this, of course, is borrowed from WMO. In WMO, we work as a community. So we thought in our legal framework, or rather in the draft bill, we talk about facilitating the interactions between the stakeholders, all the stakeholders, and we encourage the PPE as we see it as an idea that will help us work better with the rest of the stakeholders. So it's highly recommended.
Thank you. It's very good to see that the new development of this improvement of this legal frameworks is already takes into consideration the need for PPE. I will just now ask Steve to probably tell us a little bit more about his experience working on this subject in development projects. If we can, very briefly, Steve, so that we have some time to answer some of the questions through the chat. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Dimitar. I'll be as quick as I can. Yeah, well, first of all, no blueprints. Every country is different. It has different challenges. I'm struck by the diversity of legal frameworks, even from the examples today, UK to Japan, completely different frameworks, very interesting. So we should be very open to the real situation in the ground. But at the same time, let's not fight the last war. Let's be fully aware of the fact that technology is transformed. Everybody has a supercomputer in their pocket now. It's called a mobile phone. We've got linkages for communication, which we never had before. We have an active private sector providing services. And in most countries, we have particularly agriculture, but transport sectors who are desperate to have better weather information. So we should not fight the last war. We should really try and work out what the needs are, what the demands are, what the opportunities are, including in technology. And in that sense, we make sure that we ask all the right questions, provide the best people, and we can see changes. In Myanmar, I would quickly mention, the first drafts of the Myanmar hydromet law were quite unpleasant. I mean, basically anybody collecting hydromet data without a license was going to go to prison. I'm exaggerating, but it was a bit like that. Now the law, with the help of good input and good support from the World Bank, is much better. It's our open data policy. It's much more progressive. So we have to have these conversations, and we have to be open and flexible to the new changes going on. Thank you. Back to you, Dimitar.
Thank you, Steve. Very good mentioning of the reality. So that's as my favorite book on standards is entitled Standards, Recipes for Reality. We should always look at the real world, not to create a unreal one. So maybe the last one on this panel discussion, Ian, just a few words on the Services Commission. When you talk about this helping the developing countries, we heard about World Bank working in Myanmar and other countries. On WMO side, we also provide guidance on development of national legal instruments. How the Services Commission is planning to support this process?
Yeah, I think you've almost said it there, to be honest, Dimitar. Education, 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 as we say, promoting the sharing of best practices, finding out what those best practices are, what works. I mean, part of what we're doing today is exploring that. And I know I keep going on like a stuck record, but if there's one thing I'd say to everybody to start with is to look at your quality management sort of frameworks as well, because that promotes that user focus, that best practice, and will make you look at the standards. Engaging with your governments, it's come up a lot in the chat. It is fundamentally important, and the sort of way I've tried to capture it here is the fact that highlighting the fact that when we talk about the global weather enterprise, we're not just talking about how we're working with the private sector, with academia, with public Met services. You can't do the weather, you can't forecast the weather unless we all understand the global interdependencies. One part of that chain breaks down, the whole thing collapses. So you can have the world's biggest supercomputer. If you're not getting observations going into it, the right observations at the right time in the right format, then none of that's going to work. And I think that's one of the things as we move forward and with the conversations on a global data policy is highlighting, and again, I haven't got a magic wand here, but how we highlight more extensively to other stakeholders, especially within governments and maybe other UN agencies, the fact that we've got these interdependencies and the recognition that the whole value chain, right from the smallest observation up to the biggest supercomputer, is so fundamental to give you these extra few hours worth of warnings. We've had some terrible weather in the UK this week, but we were warning and informing the government 5, maybe 7 days ago. And part of our duty really should be to emphasize again that we could never do that were we not getting all that fantastic information from all over the world in every minute of every day. So it's not just about at the fact that we need to be sharing that best practice, but all of us have a duty to promote as best we can the end-to-end process, which is the global weather enterprise, and everybody that's in it, especially up through government. Thanks, Dimitar.
Thank you, and I think this is a very good concluding remark of the panel panel part of this forum. I would like to thank you all for all your responses. They were all extremely interesting and providing a lot of food for thought for developing further our guidance to the stakeholders. So we have about I think 7-8 minutes or so to look at the chat and select some questions that the panelists may, some comments. Panelists may also provide some comments on those. So I think most of the...
Dimitar.
Yes.
Just a correction. If participants, and I see there are still 127 online, will be interested to go further, we have half an hour as a backup, so we can continue a bit longer if there will be an interest. So back to you, Dimitar.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vladimir. So that gives us a little bit more time, which is great. I've selected just a few quick questions. One comes from Francois Humboldt from RMI. NMHS got significant revenues from commercial activities. Open data policy queued those revenues with no alternative funding. Is there any action to support NMHS funding? So there are several similar questions about funding. And now this related to the legal framework, which should guarantee certain funding to the public money of the NMHSs. How do you, who could say something on this potentially impact of open data policy to the revenues? How we should look at this issue? Anyone?
I could make a start, Dimitar.
Sure, please do.
I mean, this is a really much broader question than just NHMS. It's for all public sector data, and it's an issue that Europe has been struggling with over the years. I guess in the 80s or the 90s, a lot of the big thinking organizations like OECD and World Bank and so on were trying to think about how to liberate the blocked up capital that these public organizations had, the data they were sitting on that could be exploited to reduce government budget expenditure, to release the value of the data. And so more and more countries governments were starting to think, yes, let's make money out of the data we've got, let's commercialize it. So that was one strain of thought. The problem is that it actually ends up blocking the data, and people have to pay for data, then it's not accessible. So when we have the other example of the United States, which has had an open data policy for a long time, and basically all publicly funded data is open source. I mean, it's freely available. I'm slightly simplifying, but it's a long time been like that. And when you look at the American economy and the role that data's had in the growth of the American economy, the huge role it's played, you can start to think that maybe actually the public should pay for the public service data out of the public purse, but then all of that data should be freely available because we've all paid for it as taxpayers. It's already been paid for. So if we allow that data to flow, it can be reused in much more new, innovative ways. And in Europe, we've seen this switch towards open data from closed proprietary data policies, trying to make money out of the data. Even over the last 10 years, we've seen this move towards open data. And we really have to ask the question, what is best for society? Is it better for society that the data that we've already paid for flows? Or should each sector, and it's not just the Met services, it's every public sector body that holds data, is it going to separately exploit that data like a little kingdom trying to get its own revenue from its own data? So this is a really huge public policy question for individual NHMSs that have tried to go down the line or are going down the line of exploiting the data. Yes, if an open data policy comes along, it's going to harm their income. I completely get that. But this is part of a much broader conversation about data and data policy, how we spend public money, and really ultimately what is the public good? What should the government be paying for in the general interest of everyone? And after all, it's us who pays. It's our taxes that pay for this. Back to you, Dimitar.
Thank you very much, Steve. Yeah. So, Vladimir, I don't know if we can give opportunity to some participants to ask their questions through their own voice and video. I see a question from Bob Goldhammer that actually created some good discussion. Can we actually allow him to speak?
Dimitar, before doing that, just one quick comment on this previous one related to developing countries. We looked at many developing countries and NMHS business in terms of revenue generation. Most advanced had less than 10% of revenues coming from sales. But in many, it's really 1 or 2%. So it's negligible for developing countries because they're in the so-called poverty trap. Their data is not very competitive. And therefore, it's even bigger case to make for many governments that before talking about benefits of access to data, you have to ensure that your data is really valuable and quality controlled, etc., etc. So with that, Oscar, can you please, it's our help. It's our coordinator of the meeting. Oscar, can you please help us to unmute some of the participants? Dimitar, could you please repeat the name?
It's Bob Goldhammer.
Oscar, can you do that?
Actually, I think I just unmuted myself, if you can hear me.
Perfect, and please go ahead.
Okay, well, actually, Steve's comments just now were kind of a good summary of what I was trying to say, that we're trying to effect a change for the public good. And we just need to bring people together with common vision, that what part of the puzzle they have to contribute can ultimately benefit the public good by saving lives. That's the bottom line. And I've been in emergency management for, gosh, going on almost 40 years now. And what I have always found is the key thing is to get everybody working together so they understand what the challenge is and what the goal is and what their capabilities are, so everybody can contribute to making a more effective program. This is all great in theory. I recognize that in practical situations in different countries, there's definitely going to be challenges. For those of us that travel a lot under regular circumstances, that have been caught in severe weather situations in the developing countries, including myself, we've got to get a better handle on this moving forward through a coordinated program. And emergency managers are there to help.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's an excellent point, and I think this is part of the culture that should be created when we talk about what are the main principles to be underpinning these legal frameworks. The public good, the public service, and the people first principle should be always part of it. So some other people that are active on the chat, if they can be unmuted and participate in this discussion. I think I saw some comment from Fred Bransky. Fred, if you're still with us and if you can unmute yourself, please, you can speak.
There we go. Took me a little while to unmute. Thank you. This has been a very interesting discussion. I started early on because there was a lot of references to about the competitive nature between the sectors, and I think, and I understand and don't want to belittle or minimize that issue, But I think our approach should be from the opposite end. Let's start from the approach of having mutually supportive sectors that work together, and I think this is the U.S. model. I think it's a model that can be applied anywhere. It may not be implemented in exactly the same way every place, but I would like to see the conversation changed, and it is changing, I believe, and people are recognizing that it's more about how do we support each other, not how do we compete with each other. And I think that's the only point I wish to make. And so happy to hear other people's view on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Any response from the panelists? I think this is related to what we call removing barriers. And Ian, please.
Yeah, just going to come in on that because we've talked about the magic we, and I always find, certainly within the WMO community, when I've talked about members, private sector, academia, public, NMHSs, that we generally do agree on this. The challenge, and it probably just goes back a bit to Fred. I mean, what would we then do, Fred? I mean, you don't have to come back on this, but if there was a change in US government policy, and at that state, that for whatever reason, some crazy thing happened, and suddenly the whole sort of policy of everything's open and free was to change. And this for me is the biggest challenge is, we all sit there around the WMO table representing our governments through an intergovernmental organisation. But how do we get that visibility and that influence? I say how do we convince governments who do have a different view, with data, with the provision of services, about the importance of this underpinning infrastructure? I mean, it's like, charging for every single road that you want to drive on, what are you going to do with all your cars at the end of the day? You can't have toll roads literally on every single piece of the network. And even in the UK with the privatisation of the rail network, that has led to issues, therefore, with the network. That's something that's absolutely fundamentally infrastructure, is an infrastructure issue, and it becomes clearly visible to government that it's gone wrong. To some extent, we're very good at what we do, in that most of the time things work fine on the weather enterprise, and so far it's not top of the list of things that the governments need to address. But it is the government policy side of things, and that is the bit, the nut that I think is really, really difficult to crack. All around the world, and certainly talking with the UK perspective, it's something that we've grappled with for many years. Thank you.
So just to ping in very quickly, Ian, you brought up a very good point that really we haven't focused. So far, most of the discussion has been about data, but this same issue involves services and provision of services too. And that's an aspect that perhaps is maybe even a little bit more difficult of a nut to crack in some cases. So very good point.
Thank you. And John, you were asking to add something to this discussion?
Yes, I just was going to comment, bringing together a couple of the thoughts that have been expressed here. I think if you look in the emerging economies in particular, there are big challenges as it relates to making even the fundamental foundational data available. And a lot of that is because of the concern about perhaps letting go of, as Vladimir pointed out, a relatively small but sometimes important amount of revenue. I would just offer the intervention that with the capabilities of the different actors in the weather enterprise today across the globe, there are many people that may be willing to work together with NMHSs in emerging economies and try to help them to get their message to more people, more vulnerable populations that exist in those countries. We've talked about some of those challenges. And in some cases, I've even seen private sector companies willing to work together with the governments in partnership. So really, there is a lot of opportunity there. I think we do have to move beyond some of the things that have happened maybe in the past, where some governments have had challenges with in-country private sector entities not following through on what was needed for observational networks or other things like that. and recognize that today's private sector is much more diverse, and to build trusted relationships here in terms of how we can all work together toward that common purpose, because in those emerging economies, those are some of the places where there's some of the biggest weather risks and vulnerable populations that we can all work together to help get the information out to.
Thank you, John. Looking at the chat, I see several interventions by Alan. Alan, would you like to take the floor to put some of your comments to the audience?
Thank you very much, Dimitar. I just wanted to pick up a bit on the issue of data, although it's perhaps not quite directed at legislative frameworks. To me, there's no such thing as foundational data. All public data should be open. As Steve said, it's been purchased by the taxpayer and it should be open. But that doesn't mean to say that public bodies like National Met Services can't compete with the private sector as long as there's a level playing field. And to me, one of the critical factors is how to establish a genuinely level playing field so that public entities can actually compete if they are doing commercial activity. And there's a lot of skepticism that when level playing fields are claimed, that they actually are real. And this may be another area where an independent regulator is essential to be able to say if a public body is entering the market, whether they are really gaining data and expertise at commercial rates as though they were a commercial company. And to me, therefore, it's not so much an issue of saying that public bodies can't be commercial, like the American model, but rather putting in place a level playing field structure. But I know it's difficult. So that's all I had to say, Dimitar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. And yeah, that's maybe one of the most important tasks of when working on a national legal framework, how to set the fair, transparent, and level playing field. I think, yeah, the role of national regulator is what Tatsuya was presenting in Japan, combined with open data policy.
Yes, right.
At the same time, with a certain control function, is a possible model in many national circumstances. But as we heard, there is no one-size-fits-all. There, what Ian mentioned about the situation in UK, where probably I'll be right to say hydromet system is functioning very well, even without very strongly present regulatory framework. So we can agree that we can finish this with the generous extension given to us by the colleagues from World Bank by minute 45. So we have like 7-8 minutes left. And at the end, I'll ask all the panelists for some final words. But are there any other participants from the audience who would like to take the floor? You can just unmute yourself and speak. We can take one or two more questions, comments.
Dimitar, this is Alexander Marescu.
Yes, please, go on.
Thank you very much for this great panel discussion. My thanks and appreciation to the moderators and the panels and all the participants. My question relates to one of the prior comments from the participants, not the panelists. And it was the question that brought up emergency management. I would like to bring up a related topic when looking at legislative frameworks on hydromet data, and that is integrating historically excluded groups or stakeholders. So on the one hand, I do a lot of work on early warning systems with the World Bank in the Caribbean, And there seems to sometimes be a communication divide between civil protection groups and Hydromet when it concerns impact-based forecasting and early warning systems. That relationship is a little bit stronger, and that's obviously on the more on the emergency and humanitarian response side. Where I see a rather large gap is using impact-based data to inform urban planners, municipal planners, national planners, critical infrastructure like transportation, hospitals, schools, as well as directly supporting cities, whether it's zoning or planning, construction codes. And I would just like to get a brief impression from the panelists on where do they see using data in other areas that we haven't typically provided data for, like essentially creating more resilient infrastructure or more resilient urban planning. Thank you very much, Dimitar. I appreciate the moderation.
Thank you, Alexander. Excellent question. So who would like to give some views from the panel? Ian, please, go on.
Just very quickly, I mean, we are looking at these sorts of areas now with the new post-WMO reform. We're establishing things called study groups, where we are looking at other sectors that we should be looking to apply that infrastructure that we're talking about. We've got 3 study groups at the moment: one on energy, one on urban. Funnily enough, you just mentioned urban, and one on health. And that is looking. The study group on health is looking like an enlightened decision. We looked to establish that just before COVID came on the scene, and one of the areas that we've been working on actually is the application of meteorological, climatological data, environmental data, to try and get a handle on the seasonality or not of the COVID pandemic, and working very closely with all sorts of partners to actually do that in terms of just getting a better understanding on that. So that's one of the advantages of the new sort of post-reform structures within the WMO, is that we can be a bit more blue sky. And again, it's really important to talk to users from all the sectors about the sort of areas that we should be looking to explore further in that sort of way. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. And I also understand the question, Alexander's question, also on how these new types of interactions that are necessary for impact-based services should go to the legal frameworks, because traditionally, if you look at the Meteorological Act of a country, is mostly defining a scope of operation of a meteorological service, and not so much the necessary interactions and the flow of information in both ways. So the meteorological information, climatological, hydrological, whatever, but also impact information coming from the user side. So this is a very good point. What should be kind of a new approach in thinking about these frameworks? Any additional comments on this?
Just to re-emphasize that the point about the challenges sometimes in individual countries dealing with who's got the responsibility for alerting the public. There can be challenges. Is that civil protection? Is that the NMHS? Where's the line? And that, I think, is something that the country's NMHS has to have a very good, strong partnership and collaboration with the civil protection and disaster preparation parts of the government, because there can be conflict there. And again, something that needs to be sorted out at a national level to be most effective.
Thank you, John. Steve?
Yeah, I can just put a little plug in here for a new study that the bank is going to release on the climate adaptation subject on hydroclimatic risk management, which tries to look at all of these linkages between the Hydromet framework and other national frameworks relevant to hydroclimatic risk, in particular floods, droughts, and water resources management. So that is clearly a much bigger bigger question in which the hydromet framework, including the legal framework, plays a key and fundamental role. Back to you, Dimitar.
Thank you, Steve. And just before going to the last round of, with the panelists, to read quickly a question or comment from Wilfred, who joined a bit late, but from his impression from the ongoing conversation, most Africa NMHSs have limited infrastructure while trying to survive within the current financial realities. Most of their attitudes towards data sharing and exchange coming from their capacity for cost recovery. I think it's a very important reminder talking about the different level of capacity, different level of maturity of the meteorological enterprise in various countries. So this should be reflected in the work on the legal frameworks, trying to resolve this individual national local circumstances. So with this, I think the whole chat exchange will be available after it will be available for offline review. So there are a lot of very good interventions. Thank you so much for this activity. Now I would like to just go for some final comments from our distinguished panelists, and I would like to start with Stella. Stella, just what is the main message you would like to pass through this panel and this forum session from your current experience working on legal framework in Kenya?
Thank you, Dimitar. The best thing is to work with all stakeholders, bring everybody on board, and get to understand what they require and what is required of you. And then basically work collaboratively with all the stakeholders. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to participate in this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, great. Thank you, Stella. Thank you for your participation. I'll go to Dennis.
Yeah, thank you very much. My, let's say, my takeaway, also looking through the chat and the comments, there was a lot about funding, and I think that's key to change towards a better place for everybody. And I would just like to express from the private sector, we are also there to help convince governments that there needs to be sufficient funding for the infrastructure, and sometimes the message is better when it comes from both the public and the private sector, and not just from the public sector alone. So we should fight together for more and sufficient money for the infrastructure, so that we have both a better approach to the services towards the society. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Thank you. I'll go to my colleague Tatsuya.
Oh, okay. I'll be brief. There were some questions on JMA service. Let me talk about as a JMA expert. In Japan, authoritative voice is clearly ensured by its Meteorological Service Act. That's one thing. And also, JMA maintains good connection with media. And media needs to collaborate, especially public broadcasting company has to disseminate meteorological information, and so do other private broadcasting stations. So visibility and trust has been made through that sort of good collaboration with media, and leads to good funding from the government. And sometimes in the course of our 70 years of working with private sectors, there were sometimes conflicts, but we have overcome through discussions and deregulations and so on. And the last thing I would like to share with you is that data is available to anybody, not limited to meteorological service companies, but everybody who needs that data in Japan. And there are hundreds of companies who is using that sort of data. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatsuya. So the Japanese model is really one to be studied well by those who develop national frameworks. So next on my screen is Ian. So Ian, your last statement here.
Yeah, very quickly. Seeing this is all about regulatory bodies, legislation, and what have you. A priority of both the Services Commission and the Infrastructure Commission will be, generating good, user-focused technical regulations in consultation with all sectors, with all parties. So that's number one take-home message for all of you. And the second thing is just a bit of advice to everybody else. I mean, basically, as a service provider, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of measuring the value of what you do, and work with your users and your stakeholders on doing that. Because by doing that, you can demonstrate the value with those stakeholders through the engagement that Stella has referred to. So, never underestimate the importance and the value of measuring what you do. Even if you don't like what you see sometimes, it's really important to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Steve?
Yeah, thank you, Dimitar. Coming back to the question of level playing fields and competition by NMSs with NHMSs with the private sector, competition law may very well provide a solution there. Abuse of a dominant position by a weather service would be, in theory, contrary to competition law. And in this respect, a clear legal framework that very, very carefully distinguishes between the public service activities and the public service costs of the weather service and its commercial private activities, even so far as allocating cost centers and cost lines between the two parts of the business, the public business and the real business, is really important. And many countries do have competition laws in place, and it's a question really of looking to those to see how they can support the level playing field. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Steve. So last in panelist will be John. John?
Yes, my closing comment is I thank everybody for the constructive and productive discussion here today. And I think for me, that's the underlying theme, is the more we understand some of these challenges, the more that we talk through them. We love the meetings that have been organized by the World Bank and others and WMO, where we have an opportunity to sit down and talk through some of these challenges and figure out how to work better together. Look forward to those days returning on the other side of the global pandemic. And I just think that the more collaboration we have about this will unlock the potential of what we can do to help people around the world. And I want to thank everybody for their passion and their commitment to this very important topic.
So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, and apologies for extending the time a little bit, but obviously the theme was very interesting, and it's very, very broad subject. And every time we start talking about this legal and regulatory framework, we come to so many adjacent questions and so many linked questions on funding, on policies. So it's not a short discussion. It will be a very long discussion. And I think through this panel, we got extremely useful input on the work we do here in WMO, and I believe the colleagues in the World Bank that will help us develop better our guidelines and our efforts to assist countries in this very challenging work. I'm happy that more than 100 people, we managed to keep them with us to the end of this event, and my sincere thanks to all participants and to organizers, and probably I'll just say over to you, Vladimir, for closing this very good forum. Thank you.
Thanks, Dimitar. I will be very brief. Thanks again. Huge thanks to presenters. It was very juicy, very informative, and of course, I didn't expect that 100 people will stay and listen for almost 2 hours. It again reiterates that this is more important than I personally expected. my takeaway from where I see it from the developing institution is that we should spend more time on the so-called soft agenda, because we're always concentrate on strengthening infrastructure, building more AWSs, etc., etc. But in this case, setting up the field which would ensure that the legal framework, the level playing field, and other things are understood by our clients, that we can find the levers to convince the government that this is a critical public sector and it's a microcosm of the whole public system. And not just a microcosm, it's a very special area which is based on the science, technology, innovation, etc. So it's amazing how in this tiny public sector, so many important issues are cross-cutting. And that gives me hope that jointly with our private sector colleagues, which is a growing strength in this sector, we can reach success. Again, Dimitar, colleagues, thanks so much for very excellent presentation and looking forward for the future events. Thanks very much. All the best to all. And stay safe.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.